This is Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting number 7. So thanks for being with us throughout all these meetings and continuing the process. I'm Sylvia Chiborowski with Kearns and West, helping to facilitate these meetings. And I will in a minute go over our agenda for the day. But before I do that, I'm going to hand it over to Commissioner Nick Lilac to provide some welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Sylvia, and good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. And as Sylvia mentioned, especially in August in the Pacific Northwest, we know this is a time where a lot of people are able to get away for a few days and enjoy our state. So thank you for being here. Last meeting, several of us discussed where we are in the process, and we intentionally used the word that we were pivoting to looking at the draft rules to create climate-friendly and equitable communities. And at this meeting and going forward through the end of our process, we're going to really dive into this very important work. We're reviewing the draft approaches, the draft amendments to the transportation planning rules, beginning today with the climate-friendly areas, the parking rules, electric charging vehicle rules, and more. So great work. And I really want to thank our DLCD and ODOT staff, our teams that are preparing these draft rules. This is a very significant undertaking in a short amount of time. And I think they've done a really terrific job presenting to us and providing to us in our packet and for discussion today and questions. A really robust set of rules for us to think about. I think they absolutely offer bold approaches and timelines for us to consider and to discuss. And but I will also say I think this is exactly where we need to begin the conversation. And it is just the beginning. I expect there's going to be a lot of great input on the draft rules as we go forward. The rules. Will help and require cities and counties to make meaningful action to reduce climate pollution, follow through on our state's previous commitments to cut pollution from transportation, and work with local governments and other partners to boost collective purchasing power for electric vehicles and more. So I really want to, again, thanks to our team for drafting the rules for our consideration. Our work, as we know, is so important. We can, of course, talk about how important it is to reduce climate pollution, which just unfortunately creates so many negative impacts for so many of us, and for some of us, far more than it does for others. But I also hope we always, and I expect we will keep in mind all of the positive impacts that we are aiming to create together as well. Building healthy communities, a clean and resilient economy, increasing housing choices, providing transportation options in our communities, and really so much more. We've got a lot of really positive aspects of our work that we're aiming to achieve as well, and we need to. So as usual, as Sylvia mentioned, we have a very full agenda. Thank you again for being here. I really look forward to hearing from you today and certainly going forward, and I have throughout the process. So with that, Sylvia, thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Commissioner. All right, well, I'll kick it off and turn to our agenda for the day. And some people noticed that we had some mistakes in the time. So just want to clarify those as well. So our first big topic for the day will be really just an overview of the rulemaking schedule and the draft rules just as a collective whole. So just a little bit on that to put it in context. And then our two big topics for the day, like the Commissioner noted, is really diving into the draft rules for climate-friendly areas. So we are making this switch now from talking about concepts to really getting into the rules. And so this is the point in the process where we will be looking to you to think about solutions. And if the rules aren't working, what's the alternative language that you would propose, or what's the different way that you would state that, or different option moving forward? So really looking for kind of that solution-oriented comment from the group today. So for the draft rules on climate-friendly areas, we'll have a presentation and then get into breakout groups to discuss some of the key questions. Then we'll have a break and then get into draft rules for parking and electric vehicle charging. And here again, we'll have a presentation and then a large group discussion. And of course, the team will be following up with the survey to get more input from you in writing, which is always incredibly helpful. So that is our agenda for the day. And just some process reminders, this meeting is being recorded And we encourage you to get your voice in the conversation. And if you have any troubleshooting issues, feel free to put those in the chat. You can send a message to the host, Ingrid. And we do encourage use of chat for kind of just those troubleshooting pieces, but not so much for substantive comments. Members of the public are, of course, welcome to provide public comment in writing to the DLCD email address that we can put in the chat. And the meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the website. When we get into our discussions, we'll ask you to just raise your hand to get in the queue. And I think you're all Zoom experts at this point. But if you can't find the raise hand button, at the very bottom of your screen, there's a reactions button. And if you click on that, there's a little raise hand icon there. So that's where you find it. And if you're joined by phone only, then you can press *9 to get in the queue to make your comment. And I did notice we have a 2439 phone number. I'm wondering if that person can identify themselves just so we know who you are.
I'm not sure if you can hear me, but if it's 4239, this is Mallory with AOC.
Valerie with AOC. Perfect. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Okay, and we know this is a large chunk of your day and we have one break built in, but feel free to walk around and get off video when you need to. We love video when you are making your comments and engaged on the conversation, but we know you all need a break sometimes. And with that, I will hand it over to Bill just to provide some brief updates before we move into the rulemaking schedule and draft rules overview.
Thank you, Sylvia. Bill Holmstrom, DLCD staff. Just a few quick things that I want to mention about upcoming items. One thing is, we're reviewing the amount of rules that we're putting out and the number of meetings that we have remaining. We are considering adding an additional advisory committee meeting in October, and that would be in October 15th. That's a Friday. That is, so I would say pencil that date in right now for an additional advisory committee meeting. Once we've decided for sure that we're going to do that, and that might depend a little bit about how this meeting goes today, we'll send an email out and a notification out to the advisory committee and all the alternates to make sure that that is on your schedule, because we just want to make sure that you have plenty of opportunity to review these rules and give your input at the proper level that you deserve. So we have that, and then there's another thing coming up, and frankly, Kevin, you might be a little bit better to talk about this because I haven't been as plugged into this, but we have a webinar on an anti-displacement toolkit. I don't know, Kevin, do you want to talk about that real quick?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So Dr. Lisa Bates and her team at Portland State University have developed an anti-displacement gentrification toolkit for the department. And the timing couldn't be better for this because obviously displacement is something we've talked about quite a lot in relation to designation of climate-friendly areas. So that product has just been delivered to us recently. We will be holding a webinar on September 9th from 10:30 to noon to basically share the toolkit and kind of run through it. So this will be a staff kind of led webinar to introduce what we have. We're hoping that as part of that, we'll be able to stand up a spatial equity mapping tool. That's, as you know, part of a larger effort we're engaged in. But for anyone who's interested, I encourage you to attend, and we will be sending invite to everybody on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee after this meeting. So another save the date, September 9, 10:30 to noon.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So with that, we can get into just an overview of the schedule and the draft rules overview. So Bill, I think that's back over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'm just trying to figure out how to share my screen here. It's changed a little bit apparently since the last time I've done this. All right, well, we'll try it this way and see how it goes. Okay. All right, so schedule and draft rules overview. So we're just going to talk a little bit real quick about what the next couple months look like from our schedule point of view. We have our regularly scheduled advisory committee meeting that's coming up about a month from now, September 15th. We'll be probably covering some rule revisions that we'll talk about. Whatever happens today, we'll make some revisions to our rules, and we'll bring some of those back probably for a pretty brief discussion, because we still have a lot of additional rules that we haven't released yet that we'll need to discuss. And those have to do with kind of the topic areas are around the high quality bicycle, pedestrian, and transit infrastructure, making sure that we're having a process and procedure for prioritizing transportation projects that help advance our climate and equity goals, and also talking about transportation system performance standards. So those are kind of some key topic areas, and you can see in the rules that we've released so far, kind of the missing, the holes in there. So kind of a flavor of what's coming up next. And then we'll be talking with our commission later on in September, about a week after that advisory committee meeting, give them a progress report about how we're doing, and how get, if there's any questions that have come up in this meeting or the next meeting that we would like our commission to grapple with, we'll bring those to them as well. In October, we're planning a series of community conversations. If folks remember, we held these around the state this spring. Those went very well. We're going to be doing that again in October. That's the plan right now. And then, like I said earlier, additional advisory committee meeting, if we need it, on October 15th is the plan right now. And then very shortly after that, and we'll see how this works, is on November 1st, is our advisory committee meeting. Will be doing a kind of a final review of the draft rules and a review of the impact statements, which is kind of the legal requirement for this advisory committee, is that you review those impact statements and before we send those off to as part of our package to the Secretary of State in advance of adoption. And then in November, we'll go back to the commission again right before Thanksgiving and review the draft rules with them. And then not on this slide is in January is when we expect to have our first hearing with the commission. So we'll give you more information about that as we get closer. But what we're expecting to have our first hearing with the commission in January, and then a second hearing and ideally adoption in March of 2022. So unless there's any questions about the schedule, this hasn't changed a lot from what you've seen before, except that the potential additional meeting in October. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the rules then. So we've sent you a nice thick packet with lots of good materials in there, including 30-something pages of additional draft rules. So I just want to take a step back real quick and put it in context of the overall rulemaking activities that we're going through. So there's the scenario planning rules that we talked about quite a bit earlier this year, and that's Division 44. And that's still part of this process, and we're going to come back at the end of this, probably in November, and say, okay, remember Division 44? Well, here it is again, kind of we'll probably make some tweaks to make sure it's consistent with everything that we've done in these other parts that we're doing now. And that'll be all one package that will end up going to the commission. So I just want to remind people that that's a big piece of what we've talked about so far, and it was about half of our advisory committee time working on that. So then, we have two new pieces that we're introducing at this meeting. One is around housing rules, and that's Division 8. It's in your packet, item 8 of your handily, very convenient. Item 8 in your packet. There's not very many changes that we're making to that, and Kevin will talk a little bit more about that when we talk about climate-friendly areas, and that's mostly how do we integrate that into our existing housing planning processes. So Kevin will talk a lot more about that today. And then we have the transportation planning rules, and that's the large piece of rulemaking that we're going to be spending the rest of our time working on, is Division 12. And that basically, those rules talk about how local governments do coordinated land use and transportation planning. And those have been around for 30 years, but we're making some pretty significant changes to that. And so that's items 6 and 7 of your packet. 6 is kind of an overview, a summary of all the different pieces, and then 7 actually includes the rule language. So, and like I said, we haven't sent everything out. All the draft rules aren't out yet, but everything we could give you, we've given you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the transportation planning rules, the pieces of that, because it is kind of confusing because we have the existing rules and then we're adding a whole bunch of stuff and what applies to what and who applies to who. And so, you know, when you're reading the rules, it's just, it might help you understand exactly kind of how the pieces fit. So our existing rules, they apply statewide. Now there's a lot of specific sections of those rules that apply to certain jurisdictions of a certain size or just the jurisdictions within metropolitan areas. But generally, the whole thing applies everywhere. That's rules 0 through 70 is kind of what we've got right now. So what we're planning to do, and what it looks like in your draft rules, what we've done is we're taking those existing rules, or we're kind of making it clear like what applies to who. So everything that's in the blue is 15 through 55. That's just going to apply to cities and counties that are outside of metropolitan areas. So that's kind of the existing heart of the transportation planning rules. And things aren't going to change a whole lot for those jurisdictions that are outside metropolitan areas. Now, that's not to say they'll never change, but right now, that's the tack that we're taking because of the scope of our work in this rulemaking process. Rules 0 through 10, which is kind of 0 is the purpose, 5 is definitions, and 10 is kind of just general about transportation planning. Those are going to continue to apply everywhere across the state because those are kinds of things that can apply inside and outside of metropolitan areas. And we have some updates to do in those sections to make sure that it's up to date with what we want it to look like today, but that's going to continue to apply. And then rules 60 through 70 are also going to continue to apply statewide. 60 is kind of a special rule. It has to do with how local governments look at changes to comprehensive plans or land use regulations after they've already adopted a transportation system plan, just to make sure that they're going to be consistent with each other. So that'll continue to apply across the state. We're not making a lot of changes to that. And then 65 and 70 are really just about infrastructure in rural areas outside of urban growth boundaries. So there's not actually a lot inside metropolitan areas that you have to worry about with those, but we just want to make sure that there weren't any gaps that anything was falling through. So that's the existing rules. So everything that's in blue is outside metropolitan areas. Everything that's in yellow is statewide, and everything that's green is just inside metropolitan areas. So that's our new rules in that box over there. We have some new rules that apply statewide. Those are 11 and 12, and those are basically 11 is it's this. It's basically saying, well, what applies to who, and who does what, and that's what Rule 11 is about. And then Rule 12 is basically allowing us to have a set of dates that where things apply. So we can make determinations about, okay, well, it doesn't make sense for some things to apply right away. It's just going to be too hard for local governments to make that happen. We'll give you a year or however long to make this happen before that rule applies. And that's what Rule 12 is about. And then the rules 100 through 910 right now, those are totally new rules. That's the new stuff that we're building for local governments within metropolitan areas. And that's mostly what we're going to be talking about over the next few meetings here. So I just want to be real clear about like how that works. And then another way of thinking about it is statewide, it's 0 through 12, 60 through 70. Some rules just apply outside metropolitan areas. That's 15 through 55. And then the stuff that only applies inside metropolitan areas is 100 through 910. So, and that is it also in the cover memo of your packet, item 1, there's a discussion. It has kind of some of these same diagrams that describes how that works. So I think that's all I have for that piece of it. I know it's a little bit confusing and a little bit wonky, but I think it's important to have the understandings in the back of your head, especially when you're reviewing a lot of these new rules and you think about, well, who does this apply to? Well, most of the rules you're talking about really just that we're talking about are just apply to inside metropolitan areas, but there are a few little pieces here and there that are inside or outside. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. We might have just a minute for any high-level questions, but always helpful to kind of see that overview. It is certainly complex. Emma?
Thank you so much. I feel like we're really getting into the thick of the rulemaking, and we're seeing draft proposed rules. Like today's packet is very hefty, and there's even more to come, as you said. I'm curious, especially I think for the November meeting, it sounds like that's kind of the culmination where we'll be seeing a full draft package and there's gonna be a lot of content in there. Could we please get the packet further in advance? Because especially those of us who are, topic experts, for me, I'm a transportation planner, but some of the climate friendly area content and different parts of this rulemaking are more focused on like housing or land use or different expertise that I have to consult with other staff. So I'm curious if we in particular get that packet, but maybe packets now through the end of the rulemaking a bit further in advance, since the 1 week turnaround is really ambitious for that level of coordination to make these be really good quality rules.
Well, we can try our best. Our goal is to do it a week ahead of time. And if looking at the schedule, especially adding an extra meeting in there, sometimes there's only a few weeks in between meetings, and so I think that would be, I would like to do that as much as possible, but we have a lot of coordination on our end as well. So I will do my best, but I can't promise that to you now. I'm sorry.
Thank you. And Mary Kyle, and then we should move into the next topic. Go ahead, Mary Kyle.
I'll reiterate what Emma said, like in reviewing the packet. I'm going to be deferring in this conversation to people like Emma who do know the transportation stuff, and cross my fingers, and because I don't have that time to consult with other people as opposed to housing and some other things that I know more about. But my comment was, it would be useful to have a timeline, a master timeline, not of hearings and all this, but of what's in the rule, what is required by what entity and when. I can discern some of it, but not all of it. And other things are a year or 2 or 3 after something else. So that would be very useful, a master timeline of the actions in the rules.
Yeah, I think we could probably put something like that together. A lot of for Division 12, the transportation planning rules, we've put it all in one place in Rule 12. It's kind of confusing, but and that's where we put all the timelines for all the stuff that we've got. But then how does that interact with all the stuff that's in the scenario planning rules in Division 44? Is that what you're saying? You want the whole thing? Yeah.
Housing,
okay.
Things are tied to housing needs
and then
analysis,
you get the housing
capacity analysis, housing production strategies. Yes.
Yeah, and in my understanding, I don't know all the housing stuff, but some of that may be different for different jurisdictions as well. So
right.
I think that's something we can think about putting that together. Kevin, does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So we'll work on that. Thank you.
Yeah, really good suggestion. Thanks, Mary Kyle. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Young to get into an overview of the climate-friendly areas draft rules. And again, after this presentation, we'll have a little bit of time for some kind of high-level Q&A, and then get into breakout rooms to delve into these rules. And we've got about 4 key questions for the group that we'll go over at that time in the breakout rooms. All right, Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, it's true. There's a lot of moving parts here. So I'll try to step through this carefully and be as clear as I can in explaining the different components of the rules for climate friendly areas. Just at the outset, in the context of what Bill has just said, the rules for climate friendly areas would apply only within the metropolitan regions. So those 8 metropolitan regions we've been talking about. Go ahead and flip to the next slide, Bill. Thank you. Oops, I think there's one more. So let's start just kind of grounding. What is a climate-friendly area? We've talked about this before. These bullets are really pulled out of the proposed definition for a climate-friendly area. And as we've discussed, these are mixed-use areas that contain or are planned to contain a mixture of higher density housing, jobs, businesses, and services. The areas should be served by or planned to be served by high quality pedestrian, bicycle, and transit services. They should be provided with shade, weather protection, other amenities for residents, employees, and visitors. Most importantly, they need to be people-oriented, not auto-oriented areas, with the fundamental need that most Most daily needs for people who live and work in these areas can be met without need for a vehicle trip, for a car trip. Next slide, please. So the first section of the rules, and this is 0310 in Division 12, the transportation plan rules. So the first section regards the designation of climate-friendly areas. When you go to that rule, you'll see that this links to that kind of that page, that section actually in Rule 12 that contains all of the deadlines that we're proposing as part of this rulemaking effort. But essentially, this kind of frames who designates and when do they designate. So as we're conceptualizing this rule, we would ask the local governments to designate climate-friendly areas. That would include all cities with population over 2,500 within these metropolitan regions and some urbanized county areas. That urbanized county area is an important and maybe kind of obscure piece, but there are some portions of counties that are fully provided with sewer, water, stormwater, transportation services at an urban level. They feel and function and look like cities, but they're under county jurisdiction. There are significant areas like that in Washington and Clackamas counties, as well as an area, at least certain areas within parts of Marion County that function in that way. And so because those are within urban growth boundaries, but they're under county jurisdiction, that's why the county areas are included here as well. So that's who designates. Then when do they designate? So as proposed, cities and counties with population over 10,000 within an urban growth boundary. So cities and counties that share an urban growth boundary would need to coordinate on this, would designate their climate-friendly areas by March 31st of 2023. That is pretty quick, basically 1 year following adoption of the rules. But we know we need to act urgently to address our climate inequity goals. For smaller cities and counties, population over 2,500 but below 10,000, they would have 2 years to March 31, 2024. And then lastly, as we talked about, the Portland Metro region is already underway on their 2040 growth plan. And this measure would kind of help that region along, setting a deadline for cities and counties that have yet to adopt town and regional center boundaries to adopt those boundaries by March 31st of 2023. So I'll go through all of this and then we'll have some time for question and answer after I'm done. So that's designation. So another key piece of it is, okay, so that's a one-time thing. The cities, we're going to say you have these deadlines to designate climate-friendly areas, but also recognize this is kind of an ongoing requirement moving into the future. So the rules establish the requirement for cities and counties to maintain sufficient land area within those climate-friendly areas to accommodate at least 30% of total housing needs as they grow over time. And so smaller cities that cross that 2,500 threshold would have 2 years to basically designate climate-friendly areas, you know, as they exceed those population thresholds in the future. And then, as I'll talk about more later, cities with population over 10,000 will address their climate-friendly area housing needs and housing production as part of what's the now required housing capacity analysis and housing production strategy update requirements. So those came about from passage of House Bill 2003. And essentially, those requirements are for the larger cities over 10,000 population, to update housing capacity analyses every 6 years for jurisdictions within Portland Metro, every 8 years for jurisdictions elsewhere in the state, and then to follow that adoption 1 year later with the adoption of a housing production strategy for the city. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So that's how this process would work over time. All right, next slide, please. In terms of the process itself, so cities and counties would adopt these climate-friendly areas as a climate-friendly element to their comprehensive plan. So this would be require a post-acknowledgement plan amendment. And essentially it kind of embeds this concept into the comprehensive plan. That element and supporting findings that would be adopted with designation of climate-friendly areas would include maps, calculations, applicable development codes, a narrative describing the public engagement process, and analysis of fair and equitable housing outcomes. So those last two pieces are important. And I want to refer to another set of rules of our new proposed rules in the transportation planning rule. So we have a portion of rules about public engagement in sections 0120, 0125, and 0130 that speak to engagement with priority populations, decision-making processes, engaging priority populations, and an equity analysis as a component of transportation and land use decision-making that would occur as part of implementing these rules. So that's an important piece that I encourage you, that is included in the draft language that you have in your packets, and I'd really strongly encourage you to review those pieces if you haven't done that. That's part of what we're talking about. The analysis of fair and equitable housing outcomes goes a little bit beyond that to look and put maybe a little finer point on potential displacement or other inequitable impacts that could be associated with the designation of climate-friendly areas. This might be where, again, that toolkit, anti-displacement toolkit, and some of those strategies will come in handy for local governments as they kind of step through this. So anyway, those are all elements of the required findings that would be required with the adoption or designation of climate-friendly areas. I do also want to be clear, we're talking about applicable development codes here. So we're asking the local governments to amend their development codes to basically be consistent with the development code standards I'll be reviewing in just a minute within those climate-friendly areas. Then lastly, in terms of the designation process, the cities over 10,000 with population over 10,000 would use this information as a baseline in subsequent housing production strategy reports. So they can use that information that they've adopted in their findings and kind of move forward into the future to evaluate progress on, development within climate-friendly areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so land use requirements, and this is section 0325 of Division 12, the Transportation Planning Rule. What we tried to do here is balance the need to get the type of development we need to see in these climate-friendly areas without being overly regulatory. So it's not a robust set of rules, but we think this level of requirements is important to move all of our communities forward and to meet our climate and equity goals. So first off, we need to allow mixed use development, including residential, office, retail, services, and public uses. That development must be permitted through a non-discretionary review process. So what that means is that there wouldn't be discretionary criteria such as, is this visually compatible with its neighbors or that sort of thing. Local government might be able to put in place clear and objective design standards or other requirements that wouldn't conflict with these rules, but we would require that process to be non-discretionary. That tends to be quicker. It also tends to make it much easier to streamline development and for people who are looking to develop to have a clear path forward. So that's an important component. We know that we need to achieve minimum residential densities of 15 units per acre or more to support good transit service. So what we don't want to see is lower density development in climate-friendly areas that might kind of impede future urbanization or the level of development that we're needing to see there. Allowed building height no less than 100 feet. And I want to stress that's allowed. We're not saying you have to require buildings to be built to 100 feet, but local governments need to allow for buildings up to that height And we recognize that many local markets may not support that level of development, and that's fine. But what we don't want to do is to put unnecessary barriers in the way of the development that we need to see here. No setbacks from property lines except to meet life safety requirements. So if there's a fire access issue that requires a setback, that's okay. But basically what we're trying to do is to maximize the potential footprint of the development that occurs in these areas. All right, next slide. So another important provision here is that the uses and standards we're talking about must apply throughout a climate-friendly area. So to qualify as a climate-friendly area, this package of uses and standards would need to apply throughout. As I think I alluded to a minute ago, cities and counties may not adopt conflicting requirements. So certainly there's nothing that would preclude, say, clear and objective design standards, for example. But were there a conflicting requirement that, say, effectively reduce the allowed height in a climate-friendly area, that would be in conflict with the rule. For new development, we're setting a block length of 250 feet maximum. That enhances the pedestrian environment, makes it easier to make connections and more allows for more connectivity within these areas. There is a provision in this standard that allows for pedestrian-only connections within blocks to meet that standard in lieu of, say, a full public street improvement. We ask cities and counties to prioritize the location of government offices, parks, open space, and similar amenities in climate-friendly areas. And we will be establishing special standards for automobile and bicycle parking in these areas, as well as requirements for pedestrian, bicycle transit, and street infrastructure in climate-friendly areas. I think that's it for land use requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, for cities and counties within the Portland metro region, again, they're kind of in a unique situation of kind of already moving forward on the 2040 vision, or 2040 growth concept, excuse me. And so essentially this is how our rules would apply to those areas. So cities and counties who have yet to adopt town or regional center boundaries must do so by March 31st, 2023. All town and regional centers as identified in Metro's Title VI will be adopted as climate-friendly areas in local comprehensive plans. Lastly, cities and counties will need to demonstrate that development allowances within those centers are equivalent to those in Rule 0325, which is the development standards I just reviewed with you, or that the development allowances would achieve the same or better results in terms of climate and equity goals. All right, next slide, please. Okay, I think this is the last slide just to talk about how the links to the housing rule. So these are the amendments to, again, Division 8, the housing rule, section or rules 10 and 50. So as we mentioned before, cities with a population above 10,000, again, within metropolitan planning, within the metropolitan regions, shall evaluate their climate-friendly area land needs through that housing capacity analysis, those updates that they're doing every 6 or 8 years. One of the key provisions here in the rule is pretty significant. And essentially it says cities may rely on development trend data for purposes of housing capacity analysis prior to December 31, 2025. So essentially that's what I'll call business as usual. So the way housing capacity analyses are done, cities will project their land needs based on development trends within the different zones in the city and say, okay, well, if we're building at this many units per acre, we're going to need this much land in the future to meet our identified housing needs. So they may rely on that development trend data until the end of 2025, but beginning January 1, 2026, cities must demonstrate that they have achieved at least 30% of needed housing within their climate-friendly areas in order to justify UGB expansion. This is essentially clarifying, there's a section of existing rule now which which says cities need to look to make more efficient use of land within their urban growth boundaries before they expand their urban growth boundaries. This essentially puts a finer point on that to say, really, we need to achieve the level of needed housing within those climate-friendly areas before we can't keep building low density subdivisions on the edge of town. We need to build smarter. We need to do things differently if we're going to achieve our climate and equity goals. And then lastly, the rules also require a fair and equitable housing analysis for climate-friendly areas for cities over 10,000. So that's, again, part of the housing production strategy work that will be ongoing for those larger cities. There will be a component within those housing production strategies to look at what are we accomplishing within climate-friendly areas, both in terms of overall housing numbers and importantly, affordable housing numbers within those areas. We're not requiring all affordable housing to be located in these areas, but we want to make sure that cities are tracking and making sure that we're providing an equitable framework for development within those climate-friendly areas. And I think that's my last slide. Is that right, Bill? Okay. All right. So I am available for questions on that.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, for that great overview of those rules. And we have about 7 or 8 minutes here for some high-level clarifying questions before we get into breakouts. I see Paige's hand is up, so go ahead, Paige. And really kind of those high-level clarifying questions. If they're more detailed technical questions, maybe those can be taken offline. Thank you, Paige.
Yeah, so my question has to do with the 0 setbacks requirement. I have found in working with developers who are trying to improve the frontage of their space with wide enough sidewalks, sidewalk furniture, plazas, and then especially transit facilities and having adequate passenger waiting areas, that a 0 setback really prohibits the ability for us to accommodate those types of features. And so I would recommend that we try to incorporate ways for development to not be right on the property line if it is to enhance the pedestrian, bicycle, and transit experience. I think we're trying to mitigate parking, of course, being used in that setback. But I really, that strikes me as this is the wrong way, and it's going to have unintended consequences if we go with it as written. Thank you.
Thank you, Paige.
And I just real quick to respond to that. There are some rules that haven't been released yet. They're in 340, I believe, or 330, I can't remember, that will address that kind of at the citywide level, not just in climate-friendly areas, but allowing for those types of pedestrian uses in there. And again, the setback rule that we're proposing would be, not requiring, like, it's not a build to line. It's a limitation on a setback requirement. So it's not that property owners couldn't build further back. It's just that the city couldn't make them be back.
And I'll just note too, as we work on, we talked about pedestrian infrastructure requirements in climate friendly areas. We might be looking at a different type of sidewalk requirement in these areas. If they truly are pedestrian oriented, if we're going to have higher volumes, we're probably going to need wider, more urban style sidewalks than what you traditionally see, the typical 5-foot wide sidewalk. So that may be accomplished within the right of way, but I think your point's a good one, Paige. Next.
Rob. And reminder to say your name and affiliation so we all know who's speaking. Thanks.
I'm Rob Innerfeld with the City of Eugene. A very quick comment is I think there's a couple of places where some folks have, including myself, kind of misunderstood the proposed language around the building height and the setback, where we thought it was like a hard max minimum. So I think I just want to encourage staff to think about the wording you're using and just like ask yourselves, is this going to be easy for people to understand exactly what we mean? So maybe this is a little bit of a rhetorical question, but it seems like local governments are going to have about a year to adopt the climate friendly area requirements. And I really hope that you have thought through, like, is this really realistic? So, I mean, honestly, like the statewide transportation strategy was completed in 2013. The OTC didn't adopt it till 2018. Like, we've been sitting around waiting. And now you're telling us we have a year to adopt this. This is good stuff. I'm going to stop now. I know I'm not supposed to be editorializing right now, but I just hope you've really thought through everything it's going to take to get this done. It's like I said, I think it's a lot of really good stuff. Thank you.
Sure, and I'll just say, thanks, Rob, that we are very open. If you have alternative language that better clarifies this issue, that is definitely something we would be looking for in your follow-up survey information. We tried to be as clear as possible, but obviously it's challenging. So next.
Yeah, thanks. Mary Kyle.
Thanks. This is Mary Kyle McCurdy with 1000 Friends of Oregon. I have one comment on terminology that was in the slides and is kind of throughout the materials. That's the use of maintaining sufficient land, quote unquote, for climate friendly areas. And I think you should change that to capacity, which could be land, but also is likely to be changes in zoning. That's the terminology that's used in the housing rules that we just adopted, hence the housing capacity analysis. And I think that communicates we're looking at not just land that might actually go in the opposite direction of what we're trying to achieve. So if we could change that to capacity. And then on dates, a more general comment, and I think hopefully we're getting into these in the breakout groups, but following up on what Rob was just saying, there's a lot to do in a short amount of time. And yet I think most, if not all of the cities in the MPOs are going to be undergoing or already undertaking an RTP update or scenario planning or housing plan updates before the June 2023 and June 2024 dates in this rule. And it seems to me that we should be incorporating major aspects of designating CFAs in whatever's the first major plan update and no later than those June dates. Not everything necessarily in these rules, but there should be some key elements. Otherwise, someone who's updating their RTP in 2022 or 2023 will then have to be redoing it. And so I think there's key elements that should be incorporated in those first, in any major plan update that happens before then. So when you're thinking about dates, just incorporating that, and that also helps phase some of this material because it's a lot.
Right, thank you, Mary Kyle. Yes, and discussion on the deadlines for designated areas is one of the key questions for our breakout rooms. So looking forward to hearing more on that there. But just looking for some more clarifying questions, let's go to Amy and then Al, and then we'll probably get into breakout rooms.
Thank you. Hey everyone, it's MA, NAACP, Eugene Springfield, she, her pronouns. I am appreciating this kind of attention to kind of anti-displacement actions and just showing proof of how we are including these priority populations in these climate friendly areas, seeing it in kind of the required information, like including the number of income restricted dwellings in climate friendly areas, as well as showing how actions to increase the number of persons belonging to state and federal protected classes resided in climate friendly areas. I'm wondering if that is kind of like repeatedly like reoccurring, I'm wondering if it would be a reach to just include protected populations or priority populations in the definition of a climate friendly area. As it is written right now, it's not. And I'm just wondering if other people had that thought. But yeah, that just came up. It seems to make sense that why don't we just include them within the definition of a climate friendly area.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And Al?
Hi, I'm Al Johnson. I'm sitting in for Sarah Adams Schoen. I'm not sure about her name pronunciation today. And I am a retired land use lawyer. I go way back with LCDC and Goltan and have been litigating this issue and over the years, especially having to do with the integrity of buildable land inventories. And I have concerns about the 30% requirement. And Kevin, I'm wondering if there is going to be some sort of requirement for cities and counties to show that the CFAs that they designate are in fact likely to be able to accommodate the what we're proposing they accommodate. And that's especially important because I gather from your presentation that that then becomes kind of a baseline, which could turn into a loophole if those areas are designated in too narrow a way by some jurisdictions. Can you help with that?
I sure hope so, Al. I can't say that I fully understand your concern, and I would appreciate maybe a follow-up conversation on exactly the nuances you're speaking to. And that's something that, yeah, perhaps you could reach out to me individually and we could have a conversation about kind of how that plays
let
out.
me just make a one sentence version of that question if I can is, will cities and counties have to show that their CFAs are actually likely to be able to accommodate the 30% when they designate the CFAs, or is there just no requirement for that?
I think that the level of detail you're looking for in terms of actually feasibly accommodating, I mean, we're not getting to the point of market studies. What we're defining is essentially building envelopes within CFAs. We're saying, hey, you can build to this, and you can build these kind of uses, and here's what we hope to achieve within those areas over time. If you're asking about like requiring a market analysis, that's not something that we're proposing at this time.
No, I'm just kind of wondering if we can go in and designate 10 acres and say, out in the field someplace and say, this meets all the criteria that you've given us, and we don't have to show that it's actually going to do that. City of Eugene did that back in 1978. And I think they showed a high density area out in a cornfield that was supposed to handle, 3,000 units. And of course, you never did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks, Al. And maybe that's more of a conversation offline too, Kevin. Thanks for offering that. And I see a couple more hands up, but we really do need to move into our breakout rooms. So maybe you can ask your questions there if that's okay. Or if we have time later, we can get to more discussion, more clarifying questions. So I do want to just provide the instructions for our breakout rooms. So Ingrid will be assigning folks to breakout rooms, and she'll stay in the plenary to help anyone that kind of gets lost. And each room will have a facilitator and someone taking notes. And we'll ask you all to talk about kind of 4 key questions related to climate friendly areas. And I'll share those in just a second. We'll have until about 10:35 in our breakout rooms, and then come back to the main room from report outs, about 1 minute each on really high level themes. Facilitators in each room will just ask for some RAC members to volunteer to report out. And we really encourage new people to report out who haven't before, so that we get more voices in the conversation. And so in our breakout rooms at the end, we'll try to save some time to identify just some top 3 key themes for the reporter to report out. Don't feel like you need to synthesize everything. It's impossible to do that. These are all rich discussions, but just really reporting out, 2 or 3 high level key themes. And so I'll share the questions that we're looking to discuss in the breakout rooms, and then we'll dive right in. But we're really looking at sort of deadlines, process, land use requirements, and housing development. So some of you already brought up comments about the deadlines. So do the deadlines make sense for designating climate friendly areas? If not, what else would you suggest? The proposed rule outlines a process for local governments to designate CFAs. Does that make sense? Does it address kind of the equitable outcomes that are desired? And if not, what suggestions would you have for changes? Also, the proposed rule establishes land use requirements for climate friendly areas. Do you feel like that's clear enough while not being overly complex? And again, if not, what would you suggest? And then lastly, looking at the housing development within climate friendly areas. Do the proposed rules move us towards meeting kind of those overall climate and equity goals? And if not, what would you suggest? So you'll see everywhere here, really looking at what would you suggest instead if it's really not hitting the mark. So looking for that specific solution-oriented input. Okay, well, with that, I think I will hand it over to Ingrid to press the button to get us all into our breakout rooms, and we'll all be whisked away, and then we'll get back in the main room at about 10:35. So press the join button. See you soon.
Hey, Ingrid, I wrote you a note in the chat, but I had to sign back into Zoom. Can you reassign me again?
Yeah, I just got it. Here you go. Room 4, right?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
Hi, Ingrid. I popped back in. I'm happy to go into a breakout room.
Hi, Rebecca. Which one were you in?
I wasn't in one. I had to leave around 9:40, so
Oh,
I
gotcha.
missed the
Okay.
sending out.
Sure. Okay, I'll send you to room 2. Just a second.
Okay, thanks.
Right, welcome back, everyone. I think we have everyone back at this point. So hopefully you had good discussions in your breakout rooms on the climate friendly area designation. I know we definitely had a rich discussion. So I'll turn it over to folks that are reporting out to just give brief kind of high level 2, 3, 4 key themes from your breakout rooms. And our room was first, and our reporter is Mari Valencia. So I'll turn it to you. And then after that, it would be room 2, which was Cody's room, and then room 3, which was Matt Krall's room. So Mari, over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. So we did have a rich discussion. I think the first kind of item that came to mind that was underscored by multiple people was regarding deadlines. Lots of the planners feel concerns about it being a very tight deadline in terms of staffing capacities, and whether a year seems too tight or a year is enough time to just kind of advance this work. There was comments around the process for designating the CFAs, and really what that was, the core was equity concerns, how to ensure jurisdictions don't just designate CFAs in already affluent, dense areas, and instead, ensure more of an equitable distribution of CFAs into the definition to kind of mitigate that, or to have some type of oversight in that piece. In terms of the land use requirements, there was generally good support, but folks do need more time to kind of go through all of them. Someone proposed considering minimum densities for residential and commercial employment centers. Questions about how this would apply in the metro area. In terms of housing development, two questions posed. How would the 30% rule be measured? How would CFA capacity be established? Concerns that if cities are doing aggressive middle housing throughout the cities, not just in the CFAs, maybe not being able to meet the 30% rule, and a UGB expansion concern for growing cities. Those were kind of our key themes from our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reporting that out. Let's go to Cody's room.
Yeah, so Emma Newman's gonna present for us.
Yeah, some similarities with the first group. On the deadlines, we agree that they're unrealistic. Our thoughts were to extend, maybe match up with the existing planning work better, and consider using an initiate by approach to allow for the times for the public hearings and public input process to occur, since that can be a significant time associated with adoption. There was a suggestion to embed priority populations into the definitions of climate-friendly area. Right now, that's really not explicitly stated in the definition. Trying to resolve a conflict between what market conditions will support for development compared to the draft proposed rules. How can we make CFAs open to people with affordability barriers, And if it's not working, what adjustments will be made? So what are all the tools that a community can use to help with stability and avoid displacement? And then what are the alternatives if that's not working? And then I want to have some flexibility with public involvement, and there's some desire to further clarify definitions and have more consistency on the housing item. So for the HB 2001 middle housing process, the definitions of housing were established there, and then in this draft rule, it's not very clear what multifamily, for instance, means versus attached single. So just consistency across all the housing rules and making sure that the definitions are really clear.
Great, thank you, Emma. And then let's go to Matt Krall's room, and after that, it'll be Bill's room.
I'll jump in. So we had similar comments. A lot of our comments were about the calculation of the capacity analysis and some of the assumptions. The 900 square foot apartment, that's not a size that really helps with some of the needs for families, but also that seems to be kind of a net number and doesn't take into account inefficiencies in the buildings for hallways, mechanical, stairwells, elevators, laundry rooms, etc., and that maybe that's not the correct number, and that in general there may be a need for an inefficiency factor overall, because if we actually are trying to get units into these areas, you know, if someone builds a 7-story building, we've lost units on there, and they need to be accounted for in some way, or else they're going to end up sprawling out somewhere else. We thought it would be very, very helpful if DLCD did just a step-by-step example of how that works out, so we could really understand how to convert this into acreage and, you know, kind of what that would relate to our various communities. Discussion on setbacks and the conflict between setbacks and particularly tree cover, and that, you know, with the way it's written right now, this is pretty much guaranteeing that the only trees will be in the street, and so you know, is that something that we want to have happen? And then we had a discussion about potential loopholes in cities doing the wrong thing. You know, if they try to create areas where these climate-friendly areas are in places that aren't developable way out on the edge of town. But then on the other side, we were noting that if cities are trying to do the right thing, they also may be trying to put something in a greenfield area, you know, because that would then bring services and things out to that area too, and kind of a discussion about how Bend is doing some things on their planning to go more dense and have those sorts of services and affordable housing. And so how do we deal with not killing the creativity, but also keeping people from doing things that are intentionally not what we're trying to do?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And Bill's group?
Yeah, this is Patricia, and the group had a great discussion, clearly identifying opportunities for enhanced understanding, as well as among different jurisdictions for this work, as well as understanding the challenges. And with regard to the inclusion of priority populations, was mention of really looking at the intersectionality of populations that are at risk or more vulnerable. And there was mention of what I call the 3 A's, accessibility, affordability, and acceptability, which are really important. And I think a key point was made about the importance of how will we move forward and really monitor how we are really working and addressing these core issues. Lots of mention about staff capacity and timing for this approach. As I said, the multiple jurisdictions and the perception of choice versus non-choice about some of these codes and rules. There was also mention about possibly using the rural to urban transect approach, which was a new concept to me, with the CFA, and looking at low density on the edge of urban areas as something to consider moving forward. And I think the last point I'll mention was the real focus on concern about how to really engage the community on an ongoing basis, considering working with CBOs and then really looking at that sustainable engagement and involvement moving forward. And I guess the last point again is acknowledgement, as was just said, with groups and jurisdictions wanting to, trying to do the right thing, but acknowledging the complexities.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia. And last, we'll go to Evan's group.
Thanks, Mallory with the Association of Oregon Counties. So lots of similar conversations to what was reported out already. I'll note that we agree that a sort of a master timeline would be really useful of when these requirements fall into place and what jurisdictions we're actually talking about. From my perspective, specifically when we're talking about unincorporated areas, there's reference to like an urbanizable unincorporated area. What exactly are we talking about? Is that like the statutorily defined urban unincorporated community or something different? So just clarity around those definitions. We talked about having local governments maybe get into deeper detail when it comes to outcomes for different priority populations and how that might work. And we can hopefully get some tools out of that next webinar. For the land use requirements, you know, not just are these rules clear, but is it workable? Are we really, you know, are we driving the development we want? And also, is that development out there? Is the market going to come to these areas? Is something that we talked a little bit about. We touched on, and I think this was in maybe slide 17 from, I think, Kevin's presentation. If we rely on past development trends, is that going to perpetuate inequitable housing patterns into the future? And yeah, I think that's pretty much the outliers. Thanks.
Thank you, Mallory. Appreciate that. Thanks everyone for reporting out. Really great discussions, and DLCD will have plenty of notes from the breakout rooms to continue to refine the rules here. And we're a little into our break now, so I'll let you all get on break. We'll resume again at 10:55 to talk about parking. So looking forward to that discussion. So have a good break. Feel free to get off video, put yourself on mute, and we'll see you at 10:55. All right, welcome back, folks. It's about 10. So we'll go ahead and get started and get into our next topic for the rest of this morning, which is talking about the draft rules for parking and electric vehicle charging. So I'll hand it over to Evan to give an overview of the draft rule language and some key considerations. And then we'll dive into about 40 minutes of large group discussion and Q&A with the RAC. So over to you, Evan.
Thanks, Sylvia. So one of my great joys each August is that the city of Salem puts out signs directing us to fair parking. There are lots of different directions we can get to fairer parking. Perhaps they mean different things from the signs, but it's nice to see those up. We, as you know, presented on conceptual approach to parking, improving parking management and EV charging. Got generally positive responses to our direction, so we drafted some rules. Next slide. The rules, as you may have been able to digest or not, given the time, are kind of split into three parts. But before getting into those parts, I want to be clear that they don't apply to mandated parking for people with mobility-related disabilities and parking for car and van pools. We see those as public benefits. We're not trying to limit cities' ability to mandate those. And we encourage cities to make sure that people with mobility-related disabilities have parking. So those are defined out in the definitions. They're not written into an exemption in each last rule. So that's our approach to that. So the three sections, the first is just saying, hey, there's some ways to make parking regulations less onerous. There are kind of some best practices from around Oregon and from around the country that we should just say whenever we're requiring parking, things that cities can do and should be mandated to do. The second thing is kind of the core of the parking reform that we're proposing. And it's saying, hey, either simply like, let's take away parking mandates. We generally think it's best practice to not have mandates. But we realize that's not going to work for all communities. So there's a second option that cities can ease mandates and then do a couple of things. We'll get into that. And the last piece, the third piece of the parking reform is that more populous cities kind of do more advanced parking management. A great way to make sure there's enough parking is not by just boosting supply everywhere, but by managing existing parking better. So that's the overview. Next slide. Before trying to be a little bit clear on this up front, those first two chunks would apply to all the cities and the unincorporated areas that are part of inside urban growth boundaries in the MPOs. The third part would apply, different parts apply to different populations. Rules in the 405, that first part, would pretty much take effect immediately. And then some things that require city choices or actions by the end of 2022, and the CFAs per that schedule that we went over earlier, the climate friendly areas. Next slide. Okay, so what are things that we think should be in everyone's parking code? First, I love ping pong rooms. I love ping pong. I was an award-winning ping ponger when I was in 5th grade, but garages should not be mandated by cities. They are the most expensive form of parking. They will probably be built for most single-family homes. Anyway, the market will ask for that, but there's no need to mandate them. So we're saying we shouldn't mandate those. Second, while parking can be an important thing, it doesn't necessarily need to be on site itself. So people should be able to provide parking next door or down the block if that works for folks. Third, we have existing things in the transportation planning rules saying if parking is needed for transit, you can convert it. This extends that to bike. Fourth, we're saying that those developments that are doing other things to help the climate, providing clean energy in that development, we're going to try to reduce your overall costs by reducing parking mandates. The electric vehicle charging stations is pretty much the concept that we shared last time that says 20% of new spaces. And that's in line with the state legislation that passed, House Bill 2180, saying that 1 out of every 5 new spaces should have a charging station. The last two, then we say, hey, parking, how do we deal with the externalities of large parking lots? And so we said, parking lots that are over an acre are doing things that are impacting the urban heat islands and making it less walkable, having those other negative costs, and we should do some things to address that. Those who attended the talk with Dr. Chandas kind of learned about that. And we say either solar or tree canopy. We're open to different nuances on this or different mixes and matches on this, but that's what we're asking. And when people think about an acre-sized parking lot, that's 43,000 square feet. So it's about, if it was a perfect square, it'd be about 207 feet on each side. But it's probably not going to be a perfect square. So walking across that parking lot might be about the length of a football field, about, or 300 feet. So it's a pretty big parking lot that we're saying, hey, we need to make sure that those have some ways to address walkability and reduce heat island effect. And the last thing is saying, hey, we've learned through the pandemic that a lot of existing parking, there might be better uses. And cities should make sure that people who are interested in converting their parking can do so without too much bureaucracy. Next slide. So again, kind of the core of the parking reform we're looking at. This can be really simple for cities. This can just say, hey, repeal your parking mandates. And then you don't have to get into all the rest of this. Again, our experience from around the country over the last several decades, or last couple of decades at least, is that when people repeal parking mandates, some parking still gets built. The market provides. So the government doesn't need to have a role here. So that's pretty simple. But if you don't want to go that route, we have a complex option, again, focused on reducing mandates for certain types of development and in certain areas. And the complex option would then ask cities to either adopt kind of best practices and parking policies. Those are things that the commission can't require folks to do, but it's an option. And if they're not interested in that, kind of further reduce mandates in types and areas. Next slide. And I would note in the really small print over here, the cities and counties, that's the nuance that Kevin noted on. There are parts of cities that are outside. They're unincorporated areas outside city limits, but inside urban growth boundaries. So that's meant to apply to that. So when we said what types of development do we want to say, hey, we're going to cut some red tape for you. You can build parking if you want, but we don't think it should be mandated. This was the list we came up with thus far. Housing that's affordable for those at less than 80% of area median income. And that's tied to that definition in our housing rules. Publicly subsidized housing, kind of more efficient, small units. There's a lot of evidence that small units are better for climate. They're obviously more affordable. That would probably apply to pretty much all studios and about half of 1-bedroom apartments. Single room occupancy, childcare, which we've got a big shortage of, certain shelters, and facilities and residences for people with disabilities and in treatment. Next slide. The areas that we talked about conceptually are kind of brought forward into this, which says, hey, where areas are really well served by transit, parking demand is lower. And also in our climate friendly areas, those areas that have a good mix of jobs and retail and housing, we want to reduce mandates there. And there, we want to provide cities an option. One is just say, don't mandate parking there. And the other is to say, well, if you really feel like you need some mandates, let's not have them for commercial. Let's not have large mandates for residential. And let's do something called a parking benefit district, which is you charge for some parking and then you roll that back into that area. So it kind of helps residents in the area. They're paying for parking, but they're benefiting from it on the return end. Next slide. So after cities who've taken the complex option, as we call it, and have reduced those for those types and in those areas, they have a second choice. They say, okay, wow, we've reduced mandates enough. Let's do and adopt some of these policies, which are kind of internalizing the costs of parking onto those who are using it, and freeing those who aren't using it from carrying those costs. Because right now, parking is paid for by everyone, including those people who don't use it. And that's disproportionately poorer people and other people from priority populations. Certainly some people in those populations use parking, but proportionally richer consume more parking. So the four policies that we've put out, we said cities can choose 3 of these 4, and if you adopt 3 of those 4, you've done enough. One is to, quote, unbundle parking from residential units, which means you charge separately. You say, okay, your house, your apartment rent is $700, parking's an additional $50 a month. Cities have adopted this policy. The second, doing the same for commercial. The third is saying, hey, if you're providing free parking for people who drive to work, people who don't use that need to be able to cash out. And, okay, I'm not actually costing the company and making them provide me a parking space. I get some money back. And the fourth is something that we've heard from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, that people were interested in considering a tax on parking lot revenue, or a tax on parking lots. And because our understanding is you can't tax the use itself, taxing the revenue from it is an option that we're providing. So if cities do 3 of those 4, or all 4, they're good. And the last thing that's thrown into choice A, the fair pricing parking, because unbundling, when people pay separately for parking, reduces parking consumption, we're taking that cap down to 3/4 of a space per unit for multifamily. Next slide. Yeah, this thing is really detailed. The simple thing is, anyway, we're trying. So those who don't want to adopt those pricing policies, and we understand, communities would then further be asked to reduce mandates for certain types and in certain places. And you can see the list here: all studios and 1 bedrooms, dormitories, transit-oriented mixed-use development, new uses and expansions, historic districts, those that are aiming to be low impact, vacant buildings, that's something that Detroit, Michigan did. Small businesses, again, that's something that Detroit did and other folks have done. And there, that's, I think we said 3,000 square feet or fewer than 10 employees. And then taking that boundary around climate friendly areas, because and boosting it out, saying, okay, maybe some of that edge development that eventually climate friendly areas will expand. We don't want to have parking mandates in that area. And then do a couple last things: adopting parking maximums and identifying somewhere in the city that's going to have a residential district, permit district, or a parking benefit district. Next slide. Okay, so that's kind of the core of the parking reform. Then we're asking something of our most populous cities. The first thing we're doing is saying the unmet EV charging it shouldn't just be for all new buildings. We're not going to get where we need to get as far as EV infrastructure, electric vehicle infrastructure, if we just rely on existing buildings. And so we're saying on major retrofit or remodel, if it's not too expensive, install some EV charging. The second level of increased requests or increased rules is saying that the most populous cities, or those cities that are in the Portland metro area that have over 25,000, should adopt parking maximums in climate-friendly areas and along priority transit corridors. And we don't have a lot of specifics about what those maximums should be. Because parking is very area specific and parking maximums should be very area specific, we just ask cities to figure it out. And historically, cities have figured out some parking maximums. And the goals of parking maximums are twofold. One is to make sure that we don't have a lot of car-oriented development in an area, and these are key areas. We don't want car-oriented development. And the second is to kind of help builders and lenders who have a business model to take a second look at that. Say, oh, I actually can get by with only providing 1.25 parking spaces per unit. I don't need my two spaces per unit. This can actually work out better. So those are kind of the two benefits that we see to parking maximums. But again, they're nuanced and need to be area focused and designed. So we don't have a lot of specific numbers in that. And then the second thing our largest cities are being asked to do is to say, hey, we actually think there's sufficient parking generally, and we're going to repeal all our mandates. Or, you know what, we actually think that parking is scarce, and that's why we justify having parking mandates. And therefore, if parking is scarce, it has value. And we're saying, okay, if you think parking actually has value, you need to start pricing a small amount of your on-street parking, 5% by the end of December next year and 10% by the end of December, 2 years down the road. So we're kind of asking folks to make that decision. Again, it's not a large chunk of on-street parking, but that's kind of the come to Jesus moment for cities of, okay, parking, we're actually going to find that value and collect it from those who use it. Next slide. And the last thing that currently is written is just cities. So it would just be Portland, Eugene, and Salem as written currently. We've had some input that it might apply, maybe should apply to counties as well. So maybe unincorporated Washington, Clackamas County. I'm not sure of exact population counts. Is to do kind of big city parking management. To say, hey, you need to go look at where you're pricing on-street parking and adjust those prices. And you may adjust them up, or you may price them down, but that's just kind of, you're meeting the market demand. And the other three things are just saying, hey, let's be careful before investing in really big, expensive new parking garages. One is say we need to price parking in that area. Another is for really big new parking garages, do some traffic demand management. And the third is to just make sure that all these parking garages, the ground floor is convertible to a different use. We thought about making other bits convertible, but that just doesn't really make sense. Parking garages are slanted and slopey, and anything besides the ground floor didn't really make sense there. So that's what we're asking for out of the most populous cities in this draft. Next slide. I would say I know this isn't easy. Parking reform is not easy. We have a lot of resources. We are eager to work with cities on this. We've already published a lot of publications over the years, with examples from Oregon cities, with examples from other strategic advice, how to do parking management, because that's really what we're shifting to, instead of a oversupply, so you don't have to manage it. we've got enough, we need to manage it smartly, and provide additional supply after we've managed and made sure that we're making good use of existing supply. Next slide. So that was a lot. I think I am over caffeinated and probably ran through it too quick because I've been thinking about this for months. So it will be useful to me to see where the questions are, and where I can go back and clarify some things. I noticed one thing in the chat was a clarification on how the ADA spaces are going to be preserved. So how we've heard other cities deal with this when they reduce their parking mandates is they keep their parking table for people with spaces for people with disabilities. So generally, cities have a parking table in their code that says this use requires this many spaces, and X%, 5% of the spaces need to be marked as ADA, or this number. And so those percentages and those numbers would retain, and the rest of it would go away. So we would say a bowling alley, they actually, parking codes have this, a bowling alley requires this number per lane. So it might be, 3 spaces overall. So that's functionally how cities that have repealed their parking mandates across the country, and in other cities have dealt with that. And how we would work with cities to address that.
Right. Well, thank you, Evan, and appreciate that great background on the parking rules, draft rules. So we'll open it up to the RAC for questions and discussion. And like Evan said, I'm really looking for any clarifying questions, and then you will, of course, have an opportunity to provide written input in the survey. And for today's conversation, it'd be helpful to hear any comments on whether the parking rules strike the right balance on reforming parking and also providing enough options for communities to choose what works best for them. And then also your thoughts on whether the parking rules help support the right types of development. And we'll put those questions in the chat too, so that they're not up on the screen and we can see each other. So feel free to start raising your hand to get in the queue if you have any clarifying questions or any thoughts on those 2 discussion questions or any other input on the draft rules. So Rob, and a reminder too to just say your name and affiliation.
Sure, Rob Interfeld with the City of Eugene. I have a few questions that are clarifying. One is around the EV charging requirements. I thought the House bill only required that 20% of spaces are wired for EV charging. Are you saying, Evan, that the House bill would require charging stations be provided?
These rules are designed for the charging stations to be provided. Yes. So the House bill got us here, and then we're trying to add this here so that somebody can actually use it.
Okay, I think that's really important for you. I mean, I think it's interesting, and it's a really interesting idea that we'll probably support. But I think it's really important to call that out, that this is going beyond what the House bill would require. And are you sure that the LCD can require that? It doesn't run afoul of any state building code things?
So I appreciate that. So the numbers are parallel to what was in the House bill, and we feel it's kind of where the intent of the House bill was to make sure that we break through this chicken and egg problem with EVs. Our council thinks that we're able to do that, and I think that once we finalize the idea and the rules, our council will have a more in-depth conversation with Building Codes Division, and we'll be clear, because it is fuzzy, and we've struggled with that about exactly where our authority ends and theirs starts. So
great.
Yeah, those conversations are happening. Thanks for flagging them.
Sure. One other question right now is, It seems like there was more information in your presentation around the requirements for the bigger cities than was in the packet. So if you could make sure that we get access to that, unless I missed something, but it just seemed like you had more detail in the 150,000 plus in your presentation. So it'd be great to be able for us to be able to access that so we can provide any responses.
Okay, I will double check that and send stuff out that we may have dropped out of the packet. I think it was
thanks, I
on page
appreciate it.
112. Sorry. No, we'll double check that.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thanks, Rob. And Alex?
So I had a question on Rule 415, Section 1 in the write-up. It said that charging stations to be installed upon major remodel or renovation. Is that of the parking lot, or I was confused. It almost sounded like maybe a building associated with a parking lot if this is a standalone parking lot. So if there was any clarification on that, and also with an exemption if doing so proves too costly, that's kind of open-ended. So I'm curious, and I did not go back to the rule to read it. So I'm just reading from the section, page 5 of 7 of item 5 of this meeting packet. So those are a couple questions or clarifications I'm looking for.
No, I appreciate that. Let me just, hopefully this is helpful for me to share it. So the exemption can be granted if the cost is more than 30% of the proposed alterations is the proposal there. And the hope was that it would apply to existing park garage or commercial buildings with more than, and also those with parking spaces on a lot, or so residential developments. So it's the building, or it's the parking lot, or it's a parking garage. And there may be some language clarification that's needed there, but hopefully I'm happy to follow up with you on that.
Thanks, Alex. And Emma.
Thanks, Emma Newman with City of Springfield. To Rob Interfeld's comment, I think it might be simpler to not have a separate Rule 0415, because if we could just have all the parking stuff in one section, it might be simpler from a reading and legibility perspective versus, oh, I thought I read the parking section, and then there's a whole nother section that applies even more on top of that. Beyond that, I have a couple clarifying questions kind of around the role of governance and what should be set at the state level versus what should be set at the local level. So particularly 0405 section 4, I'm curious to hear like what problem is that trying to solve? So that section is talking about, you know, in the COVID context, during the pandemic, communities have discovered some parking spaces may have better uses. And you know, Springfield's had temporary use permits under the emergency orders. There's been a lot of work across the state to adapt and be flexible in the current context. But I'm wondering, like, is there a problem statewide that needs to be solved by state requirements? Or is that already being addressed at the local level, and maybe that's not an appropriate role for the state to play with state rulemaking?
No, I appreciate the comment. I think that when staff looked at various codes and what was going on and how easy it was to convert parking to other uses, there were some examples. This wasn't, I didn't do this work, but our other staff did, and that they felt were overly onerous. As the overall goal of this rulemaking is to create more climate friendly and equitable communities, we feel that converting parking to other uses often furthers that goal. But we can relook at that section and decide whether the edges that some cities had limiting that were sufficient enough. Yeah, I certainly think that section more than a lot of the other sections. That's a smart question, or that's an important question to really rethink about. So I'll think about that, and I'll maybe follow up with you offline.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks, Evan. Jonathan.
So I guess I'll preference my comment by saying, I do believe in the objective of reducing parking spaces for all the reasons that you've talked about in the staff report. This is a conversation that's been going on for decades. I do think you're going to have a really difficult discussion when you get to the different local governments, especially as you talk about applying these rules around the whole landscape as opposed to the climate-friendly areas. In the options, the options all have things that jurisdictions would have to do that are non-land use. Pass an ordinance to do a tax, track businesses who provide free parking or subsidized parking, and those sort of things are a little less straightforward to maintaining them or having them happen, as opposed to things that you can put into your land use codes. I would note that when the 2040 growth concept functional plan was created, there was a whole table about parking. And Gresham, like many jurisdictions, went through a process where in some places there are no parking requirements, in other places they've reduced them. Everywhere has a maximum, and those sort of things. But I think it was a real controversial thing, and eventually that kind of got taken out of the. If you go to the parking title now, you'll just see it's been repealed. So I'm trying to kind of say that this is going to be a pretty difficult conversation. The final comment I wanted to make is the use of the term mandate kind of feels to me, get rid of evil parking sort of thing. The mandate word has, in our context today, has had a lot of, I would think, sort of negative context. So I just would wonder about thinking about how you present this. So I guess my takeaway is it's going to be a difficult conversation. You might think about if there are ways to get to it that don't require, that can be dealt with in a TSP or in a land use code as opposed to a tax or whatever. Yeah.
I appreciate those thoughts, Jonathan, and again, well, one of the things we've tried to do is make those things that the commission can't require be an option. So yeah, we certainly will continue to review this with council about what exactly is our authority. As far as and parking is a difficult conversation. We certainly understand that. And in some ways we're hoping that having it within the bigger context of the question of how do we create more climate friendly and equitable communities, like that's the goal. Instead of just what should we do with parking? Like, the real context is how can we get there? And parking has been a big hurdle to getting there. Again, most of these rules don't limit parking. They more say parking should be diverse, just like the developments are diverse and people's parking needs are diverse, and people should figure that out. And we should take our foot off the accelerator on forcing a bunch of parking to be developed everywhere, because that has all sorts of negative implications that we've gone over. So there are some sections of this that say, oh, let's actually set some caps, some places. But generally, it's more asking people to think more carefully about how much they really need to develop. And some are going to provide a bunch of parking. and that's the nature of the beast. But yeah, I certainly, yeah, I think that's all I have to say, and I'll let other people speak.
Yeah, thanks, Evan, Jonathan. Just want to see if other people have thoughts, and it's great to hear from folks and from the cities, and wondering too if there are any of our environmental justice and equity representatives or representatives from transportation uses, housing, commercial development, just getting some other perspectives in the room from others. Kind of what are your reflections on these draft parking rules? And even comments like "this all sounds great" is fine if you don't have a specific comment, or "this doesn't make sense to me." That's helpful to hear as well. So any others? Let's see, Amy.
Hello. Something that I just heard recently, just speaking to a community member, they are concerned about the safety of on-street parking. It increases kind of pedestrian interaction with moving cars. I know for me, it's really hard to see people kind of coming onto the street or crossing the street from in between parked cars on the side of the street. So that was just something that was brought up by a community member that, they understand, planners kind of get into the weeds and tend to have, their kind of vision of what an ideal built environment looks like. But for people kind of walking around, for this specific person at least, the thought of more on-street parking was kind of more of a safety issue. Just that I'd kind of bring that consideration into this space.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Really appreciate that thought, and I think that practitioners, that often relates to the speed of traffic on a low speed. On a higher speed road, it can be helpful to have on-street parking to provide a visual barrier for those people on the sidewalk, and they're not as near to that traffic. But in a low speed area where people are deciding to cross the street between cars, it also relates to the desire to daylight intersections, and a lot of cities don't regulate the 30 feet near intersections well enough, so it does have those visual barriers. So if there are things that, there is a real balance there, and there's a little wonky thing in the draft rules about screening parking lots to try to make it more comfortable, like a more pleasant pedestrian environment. So if there's a suggestion on terms of how on-street parking should be designed, to make sure that we're addressing those concerns, we'd love to hear ideas.
Yeah, thank you. And Emma?
So a comment that can relate to Emma's statement about safety and on-street parking. In section 0405 and then section 1D and E, it relates to kind of changing the use of on-street and off-street parking places. And so right now, as I'm reading subsection D, it says property owners shall be allowed to redevelop any portion of existing on or off-street parking areas for a number of different uses. And when I read that, I was like, okay, is this meaning that private property owners who are not trained in traffic engineering and have the safety expertise can choose to put whatever use in the public right-of-way, and they're now controlling public space? Because that's pretty concerning. So I want to see this section reworked to emphasize safety and also to not be in conflict for subsection E in particular. The provision of on-street parking and off-site long-term lease parking and shared parking shall be allowed to meet parking mandates. We have a similar statement in the Springfield Code, but we also added that in those situations where private development is essentially using the on-street parking to account for some of the parking minimums, it cannot be used in locations where there are adopted plans for bike facilities. We already have a hard enough time trying to get bike lanes and bike network connectivity built without development counting that on-street parking, current on-street parking space that's been planned for a future bike lane or a bike cycle track or whatever. I'm going to propose in the worksheet a little bit of amendments to these two sections to kind of retain the public control of the right-of-way for the safety concerns that Emma just brought up, as well as making sure that there's not a conflict between what's being proposed with the on-street parking, counting for minimums, and the planned TFP projects that will get us the robust bike network that's needed to support the land uses that climate-friendly areas and these rules overall are aiming towards.
I appreciate that, Emma. I look forward to those suggested edit. So that section D, a lot of Oregon cities have provisions like that. So figuring out what actually goes in the rule and what goes in the guidance will be, yeah, I look forward to your comments and figuring that out with you.
Thanks, Evan. Let's go to Al, since we haven't heard from you yet on this topic, and then to Rob. So go ahead, Al. And Al, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
I just want to say you haven't heard from me because I think everything you're doing here is terrific. But in response to Emma's comment and concern, it might be a good idea for the rule to include something that would effectively allow cities that have required this in the past to take that sort of cloud off of the any existing on-street parking areas that have been required in the past, so that those are freed up, so that they don't provide a continuing problem for designing safe bicycle routes. Just kind of let cities off the hook so that they don't have to enforce those anymore and can go ahead and plan for their bike safety. Thanks.
Thanks, Al.
Yeah, Rob.
So, thanks. There's a provision in here that would require that if cities chose to keep parking mandates in climate-friendly areas, they would have to provide parking benefits districts for any paid parking that's on, I assume, on street parking. And we already have paid on street parking in a lot of areas that would likely become climate-friendly areas. And I'm concerned that if we chose not to completely get rid of parking mandates, we would be forced to make these benefit districts. So we would have to take the parking revenue and put it back into that particular area. And it's a great idea and concept, but our parking fund is hurting now due to COVID, and I don't know how long it'll take it to recover. And so it's a kind of finely balanced fund that, you know, is not, we get revenue from on-street parking, but we also have to do enforcement in residential permit parking areas, which is probably more of a loss area. And I know residential permit parking is a kind of key to make this whole construct work. So I just want to encourage you, Evan, to think about that requirement, or maybe make sure I'm understanding that correctly. Would we have to, if we already have paid on-street parking in a climate-friendly area, would we have to make that a parking benefits district if it's already paid parking?
I think as it's drafted, yeah, but I'm happy to adjust the draft. Probably, certainly parking enforcement is an important part of making parking management work well. So happy to take a relook at that and exactly how that works. One thing we're hoping to do, you know, the joy of a parking benefit district is reinvesting in making transportation choices in an area like walking and biking better. And cities often struggle to find the resources. So as you say, it's a great idea, but maybe we don't need to require it if you're doing other things. So I'll follow up with you on that.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thanks. And Margie.
Thanks. So there's a lot here. So again, I'm just going to offer Metro's happy to meet with staff to talk about this outside of this meeting, but big themes as it goes to parking. We like DLCD wanting to address this at the statewide level. We here at Metro, we're relooking at our parking policy and plan to update it over the next 2 or 3 years. I think allowing some flexibilities for cities and counties working on this. There's other options than those that have been listed, such as timed parking. There's a lot of different ways to do parking, and there are steps into parking for smaller cities who have never regulated parking at all. So I would just encourage flexibility in the rule, and I'm not sure the complicated option completely gets you there. I also, there's a mention of transit priority areas, and we did not see that defined in the rule. And in terms of just transit in the metro area, we have all different types of transit. We have light rail, we now have bus rapid transit, and obviously frequent transit. And so, again, that needs to be kind of flexible of what we consider transit. Happy to meet and to dive into those even more. The last thing I was just going to mention is on the EV charging. Happy to see that. I think someone raised questions about building codes. That was one question we had. Also, it seems to be requiring level 2 chargers or level 3, and the technology keeps changing. And I guess I would caution against requiring any certain level of charging, as this is a changing field and technology develops further. Thanks.
Thanks for those thoughts, Margie. And I'm sorry if I'm breaking up a little bit. I understand that I'm breaking up a little bit. So yeah, certainly want to get that balance on flexibility versus reform, right? So if other people have thoughts on options that might work better for some cities. The priority transit corridors is a definition that's forthcoming, and that's part of other work. But yeah, it's so sorry that we didn't have that definition for you. Yeah, and we'll look forward to meeting with Metro staff to get your thoughts and make sure that this integrates with your goals as well.
Yeah, thanks, Margie and Evan. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other hands up. Any other thoughts, comments, questions on the parking draft rules?
Could I hop in again? Again, something that I'm hearing, I'm not in Oregon, I'm actually in the city of Atlanta, and they're kind of proposing some upzonings near transit corridors, and kind of the typical, not in my backyard folks are fighting that using the destruction of tree canopy as a talking point. And that, I guess we know that if we are encouraging denser development, there might be inevitably the destruction of kind of green space, or kind of, I think greenfield sites was brought up before. And so also thinking about how to encourage the conversion of parking lots and reclaim those for tree canopy and green space, particularly keeping in mind urban heat island. So like, how do we kind of balance the need for increased density and development with the need to still preserve green space, considering the impacts of extreme heat. So yeah, I know that a little bit of that was in the rule language, kind of reclaiming parking lots, but specifically for green space, considering the heat domes that we've been experiencing in the Pacific Northwest.
Thanks, May. Yeah, so certainly good ideas. Look forward to if folks have ideas on how to expand that. One of the goals of parking reform is to limit the amount of stuff that needs to be turned into big asphalt islands, and make sure that it's not overbuilt. So we're hoping that one of the co-benefits is fewer trees are destroyed, and yeah, there's more ability to have green space and parks and other things that are critical for our cities and the people living in them.
Yeah, thanks. And Ariel, your hand's up.
Thanks. This is Ariel from the League of Oregon Cities. I know that there's been already some requests for more time, more meetings to kind of dig into a lot of these details generally. And I think that the parking conversation specifically could really benefit from a dedicated technical type meeting to kind of flesh some of these questions and considerations out. I'm also just really struggling with some of the assumptions that have been shared, and Evan, that I think are guiding some of these policy direction. You mentioned something in your presentation about lower income folk are more likely to not use parking and shouldn't be paying for it. But what about, the folks who have to live much farther away from their jobs in order to access affordable housing and do in fact rely on cars and, less reliable transit? So that's just an example. Just would like to better understand some of these assumptions, kind of look at the on the ground impact, some of these examples of pre-existing policies in cities, and how the rules will impact that, and just really urge for a dedicated meeting to unpack this more.
Sure. Certainly happy to share the demographic research and sources on who's using parking and meet with you and other folks at the League separately. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mallory.
Thanks. I had a really similar comment to Ariel. I see a couple of areas that maybe a technical advisory committee would be really helpful. Instead of having a bunch of one-off conversations, if we can just get the practitioners in a room to work through some of this, I think that might be a really efficient way to go about it. And I'd be happy to help organize that.
Thanks, Mallory.
Great, thank you. Okay, anyone else? Any other thoughts on the parking topic? We'll certainly appreciate all of the questions and comments. And Evan, do you want to say anything about kind of next steps on this, or the discussion questions that will be sent out? Any thoughts there?
I think that we, as expected, looking forward to some conversations with those who will have to implement this in a series of meetings, and maybe larger group meetings, and some one-off conversations and emails and things like that to iron out pieces there. And some of it may change a little bit after council gets in there and figures out exactly where our authority ends and building codes continues. There are 4 questions in the packet. Really trying to get this balance right, thinking about the least populous cities and whether their role in this, and just if there are other development types that folks think, hey, we need to encourage this development, and if we can cut a little bit of red tape and costs some thousands of dollars off the cost of things, open to hearing other things. We have a list of maybe 8 development types, but maybe it should be 15. Bowling alleys need park. No, I'm just kidding. But there are codes. So thanks for your engagement. We realize this is a tough thing, and cities spend a lot of time trying to get this right. So we want to be good partners with that, while also meeting our climate and equity goals. So look forward to emailing and setting up some conversations with y'all.
Great, thank you, Evan. Okay, well, I think this brings us into our next steps and wrap up. So I'm going to hand it over to Kevin to just walk through some upcoming meetings, and then over to Commissioner Warren with just wrap up remarks.
Thank you, Sylvia. And thanks again for your engagement today. I know this is pretty detailed stuff, but it really, this is important, and we appreciate very much your time on this. So in terms of next steps, so our next RAC meeting is September 15th from 9 to noon. That's about a month away. And I'll just put in a plug here for giving us more specific guidance in the follow-up survey that will go out after this meeting. We'll be sending that out immediately after the meeting. We're hoping to get your responses back by Monday, August 23rd. We know that's a short turnaround, and we've heard we need more time. The issue that we face is that if we are going to consider all of the comments we receive and fold those into revisions in time for that September 15 meeting, we also need time. So to the extent you can, if you could please get us those survey responses by end of day on Monday, the 23rd, we'd really, really appreciate it. So on that meeting, September 15th, we'll be looking at revised versions of the parking and climate-friendly area rules, as well as the other rules. So that'll be our first look at the transportation prioritization and transportation performance standards. I can't remember the other area of rulemaking, but yeah, you know. Also, a save the date, a reminder for you on that potential additional RAC meeting, October 15. Tentatively, we're looking from 9 to noon on October 15. So if you could just reserve that space on your schedule, and we will be making that call. I'm not sure. We'll know at our next meeting. So if you could just hold that space, that would be much appreciated. And then lastly, look for an invite to the Anti-Displacement Toolkit webinar that will be on September 9th from 10:30 to noon. Looks like, before I go on, Margie, you had a question?
Well, thank you for all your work. I know getting all these rules together, this is a lot. So thank you for everybody who's worked on the rules to date. I will say for this step in the process that getting comments to you on the survey by Monday is not a really reasonable timeline. You've had, time to digest it, but our team is still digesting it. And really the survey answers we're treating it as our comments on the rule. It's equivalent to comments on the rule. So I just ask you for time, especially those who we are looking at every aspect of 123 pages of it. So out of respect, please allow us a little bit more time. And I respect the work that you've done for this to date, and we want to get you good comments.
No, that's a fair comment. That is a fair observation. I guess I'll just say strive to get those comments to us by the 23rd. If certainly next week, in order, for us to get those into the next revisions, we really do need those by the end of next week, I'll say. So that would be the 27th. But it's going to be challenging. I will also note this is iterative. So we'll be looking again at revised rules in September. If there's a need for that October meeting, we may have further opportunity to really refine these rules as we go before we get to that November kind of final look. So start with the big picture stuff. We obviously really appreciate specific detailed language suggestions in what you give us, but that's a good reminder. I also want to preserve a little space for Evan to talk through. There's one of the survey questions that you're going to see that want to just give you a heads up on. Most of them are the ones that we've already looked at. There is kind of a quick sort of temperature check on some of the climate-friendly area rules that shouldn't take a long time. But Evan, if you could speak to we have a question for you on the term priority populations, essentially.
Yeah, so we're learning as we're going. As you all are aware, we started this conversation saying historically and currently marginalized populations, and got some feedback from you all that was not a great term for us to be using. And we shifted to priority populations. We got feedback from the commission that saying the term priority population might not be sufficient to really provide context or recognize the hurt and damage done by historic and current practices. So one of the questions provides a few options on a terminology for the populations that we're looking to pay particular attention to and further equity of. So there are some options there. It's priority populations, equity populations, underserved populations, which is something being used nationally, or underserved and discriminated against populations. It's impossible for us to capture everything that should be captured in that in a single concise term, but we're trying to get a little bit of feedback and your insights on what might be the best option there before we finalize that in our rulemaking and our context. So trying to get that right. Thanks for insights.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. All right, well, with that, I will turn it over to Commissioner Warren to close us out.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. Let me just bring up my notes here. Thank you again, everyone, for your thoughtful engagement today. This is the point where the rubber starts to hit the road, and it's kind of exciting, kind of scary at the same time. This is where our ideas coalesce into rules that will be implemented. Although it may seem painstaking at times, your engagement is at this juncture is very important. Consequently, please be sure to complete the follow-up survey questions, preferably while the topics are still on your mind, like Kevin was talking about. And please remember, the more specific you can be with those suggestions, the better. If you have any ideas for alternative rule language in some sections, please let us know. We'll be back with you on September 15th to review revisions to these rules, as well as the remaining rules we'll be working on. Thanks again for your time today. You're a vital part of the important effort. I'd also like to extend a huge thank you and kudos to the DLCD staff who have risen to a very high level of responsibility. I think many of us RAC members were asking when we were going to see these rules, and now we're surprised by how much information there is to absorb. I know that I will be spending a lot of my time over the next few days trying to get my head wrapped around all the rules and then try to go through comments so that I understand as a commissioner really what our rule is going to be when this comes in front of the commission in the not too distant future. So have a great afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thanks, everyone, for your participation. Have a great day.